Guardian Druid is proving itself to be one of the best decks post Schomance Academy. Schomance? Post Schomance Academy. The namesake card of this deck is Guardian Animals. Guardian Animals summons 2 beasts that cost 5 mana from your deck and gives them rush. So you essentially have to build your deck around this card, where you only want a few beasts that are about 5 mana. In most cases, it's going to just be beasts that are 5 mana. You can summon, so Twilight Runner, of course, the new card that got released, is one of the best cards you can summon with this, along with Lake Thresher and Teacher's Pet. So you want to get to 7 mana as quickly as possible, or be able to cast this for free with Sunstrider. So of course you want to get there as quickly as possible, so you have some ramps like Wild Growth and Overgrowth especially, to get you there as quickly as possible, along with the newly released Lightning Bloom and Innervate. All these cards kind of work together to push, and also work well with Sunstrider, to push out your Guardian Animals, and then eventually you'll want to cast a Survival of the Fittest, and this will not only outvalue your opponent in almost every way possible, but will usually just finish the game. And then you have backup in the form of Ysera. This card by itself just shuffles in 7 dragons, and is usually enough as a backup plan if your Guardian Animals isn't very successful at finishing off the game. So some of the general strategy when you want to, there's two basic hands that you get that you want to basically keep. The first being a combo hand with Kael'thas Sunstrider, Kael'thas, I can't say this guy's name, Kael'thas Sunstrider. I'm just going to call him Sunstrider. So the first is, of course, a combo hand with Sunstrider in order to get an early Survival of the Fittest or Guardian Animals out. One thing to remember is that he also counts spells that are cast before his turn. So like on turn 3 or 4, you can use Lightning Bloom and Innervates in order to get him out early, and then play a Survival of the Fittest or a Guardian Animals. If you do have the choice between playing a Guardian Animals and a Survival of the Fittest, as long as you're not dying, you should play Survival of the Fittest, because you should be able to play Guardian Animals a turn or two after you've already played Survival of the Fittest, or perhaps you can do it earlier, depending on what cards, small spells you have in hand already. The other possibility is when you don't get Sunstrider and you end up with just your second plan is to play Overgrowth and Wild Growth to essentially ramp your way up to playing a Guardian Animals or a Survival of the Fittest very quickly. As it turns out, you draw a lot of cards with this deck with the combination of Overflow and Twilight Runner. So getting to these cards isn't actually as difficult as it looks. Your deck does rely on Guardian Animals and Survival, but you will most likely draw them every single game that you play with this deck. Now, one big problem with this deck is you can run into a whiff situation where you essentially draw your beast before you draw Guardian Animals, and these guys are not as powerful when you're actually paying 5 mana for them, especially if you don't have a Survival of the Fittest already out. So sometimes you kind of auto-lose those games, and that's okay. You know, the deck is powerful enough that you win more games than you lose because of that. It is just something to be aware of, that sometimes due to time efficiency, you should concede the games where you're drawing all your beast and you haven't found any Guardian Animals or even any ramp, just to get to there early. As for the Mulligan guide, you're really looking for that Overgrowth. There is a possibility that you keep Sunstrider. In most matchups, I would consider keeping Sunstrider. He's really important to the game plan. And if you have a Sunstrider, I would keep Innervate and Lightning Bloom. And these cheap spells. Nature Studies, of course, you also want to be keeping. So you're really hard mulliganing for this ramp, and for Nature Studies possibly, to find you cheaper ramp or find you more ramp to get there as quickly as you can. You definitely don't want to be looking for any of these beasts. These beasts, you really don't want these in your mulligan. Also, keeping Guardian Animals is pretty important. Getting this out on turn 7 is one of the best ways to win the game on the spot. And I would consider keeping a Survival of the Fittest if I already had a Sunstrider in hand. So like if I had like a Lightning Bloom, Sunstrider, and Survival of the Fittest, I would keep all 3, just because you're very likely to find another card you can play to combo with Sunstrider and get that survival out quickly. Against more aggressive strategies, you might be more inclined to keep Bogbeam or Crystal Power in order to sustain and stabilize in the early game. For the matchups for this deck, really have a good matchup really across the field because of how powerful and how quickly this deck can overwhelm your opponent. The real decks that you struggle with are going to be those hyper aggro lists, decks that really crush you before you get the opportunity to cast a Guardian Animals, or that can still kill you even after you've played a Guardian Animals. Thankfully, these decks have become a little less popular since the beginning of the expansion, so now Druid is kind of becoming one of the best decks in the format. So there's two other poor matchups. It's going to be Priest and Paladin. Both of these decks can outvalue or simply wipe your board often enough that it's very difficult to set up. Even after a Survival of the Fittest, they'll just wipe your board either with the Librim of Justice or one of Priest's many board wipes. They're just able to clear you more often than you're able to produce minions. Of course, the key to winning these matchups is going to definitely be Enlarge Ysera, or getting a survival off very early with a Sunstrider, and in combination with Guardian Animals. Now, this list that I've been showing you is the most popular list, so let's look at two other lists that have kind of come into fruition. The first one being a Broomstick list, so essentially you're running Animated Broomstick as a replacement for Crystal Power, and you also cut the Defender here for another copy of Lake Thresher and Overflow. So this deck will probably have a bit of a poor matchup against the aggro strategies, but will be much stronger in the Paladin and Priest matchup because they're able to rush out their minions in order to get value before they are able to be board wiped. They also have just more sustain in general with the Overflow, and a less likely chance for your Guardian Animals to whiff because of Lake Thresher. Overall, I've really enjoyed this list quite a bit more just because of the good matchup against Paladin. Now, of course, once you get into Legend, Paladin is much less played, so I would consider swapping over to the other Druid list when you're more likely to encounter hyper aggro. The other list that I've seen that's been kind of floating around has been this Exotic Mount Seller list. Of course, they're running 2 copies of Exotic Mount Seller. Because of the Moonfire, they're going to have an easier time comboing with Sunstrider. The downside, of course, is they're only running 1 copy of Teacher's Pet and 1 copy of Lake Thresher, so it's very likely that your Guardian Animals is going to whiff. They're also only running 1 copy of Survival of the Fittest. This is because this deck doesn't rely as much on the Survival of the Fittest combo. This deck kind of looks like, I actually haven't got a chance to play with this deck, but it looks a little bit like it's going in more than one direction and might have trouble. But if you were a fan of the Spell Druid before the expansion came out and want to go off with Exotic Mount Seller, this is definitely a list to give a look at, and perhaps you can make some changes to perfect it. Another thing, I'm going to look at the stock list for a moment. Not everybody's been running Wild Growth. Usually Overgrowth is enough, and Wild Growth is kind of too awkward to play around and usually just ends up drawing you a card later in the game. So you can cut a copy of Wild Growth and add an Overflow in the stock list, and this will just allow you to have more refill potential rather than having the awkwardness of the Wild Growth. And that can go, I think, for all of these lists, or perhaps you can cut Wild Growth in the last list for something else because they had 2 copies of Overflow. Another thing, when you're looking at Speaker Ghidra, whenever your spell is reduced because of Sunstrider, it will trigger Speaker Ghidra for +0/+0. Essentially, he won't gain, he or she, it's a she, right? It's essentially a waste. It won't gain any attack or health because of the 0 cost. So if you like want to make this a 11 whatever because of Survival of the Fittest, it's not going to work unless you hard cast Survival of the Fittest, and it's very likely that you're not going to let this survive for another turn without casting any just other spells before you end up casting Survival of the Fittest. So just something to keep in mind. The same thing with Defender here. Defender doesn't trigger if you reduce the cost with Sunstrider. That ends up happening a lot more often than you might think it does. So that's something to be very aware of before you start playing this deck. Another cool line at the very beginning is Nature Studies. You can cast Nature Studies, discover any spell you want, and then cast Overgrowth on 3. This allows you to push your Overgrowth turn a little earlier and allow you to play something on turn 6 or innervate out Guardian Animals or whatever you want. I think that's all I wanted to cover. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. And yeah, I think that's about it.